Hello and welcome to the Modern Adventurer podcast. Coming up.
Pip, what you're doing is remarkable, not least because it is neo-colonial and racist. And then, that's a hell of a message to receive. My initial reaction was very unhelpful. It was sort of one of classic white fragility, tears and embarrassment and the worry that people were going to see me and what I was doing as racist and feeling their pain. It really brings it to life in a way that, we can talk about deforestation from the comfort of our homes and then check and scroll through Instagram. But when you're like, oh my gosh, you've actually lost your dad, your family at risk every single day. And I think that for me was just really woke me up to the issue.
My next guest is an adventurer and journalist. She has done some incredible adventures over the years, from starting from absolutely nothing to deciding to cycle from Malaysia to London, where her adventure kicked off. We discuss some of these incredible trips that she's done down the years and have quite an honest and frank conversation about the sort of future in travel and how one should be more responsible in the way we sort of communicate in exploring. So I am delighted to introduce Pip Stewart to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, John. Nice to be here.
Absolute pleasure. Well, it's so great to have you on. As I say, I have followed you for many, many years, and to get you on the show to talk about some of your adventures is just amazing. And before we sort of jump into your adventures, I always like to start at the beginning and sort of talk about how you got into it and the sort of early stages of your adventure career.
Yeah, well, actually, like many of the guests on your podcast, it was a complete accident, really. I had a bit of a false start in business. I used to work at Innocent Drinks, like selling smoothies into schools, and I quickly realised I was a bit shit at this, and I sort of left before I was sacked, to be honest, John. And essentially, I knew that I loved travel, I knew that I loved meeting people, and I was sort of looking for a way to make taking out a year to sort of reconsider what I wanted to do look legitimate to my parents mainly. So I applied to go back to university to do a master's in journalism, but in Hong Kong. So I thought, okay, cool, I'll scratch that travel itch. I'll get something useful out of it potentially. And it turned out I absolutely loved journalism, and I loved sort of being in Hong Kong and learning from my colleagues. And yeah, so that sort of started this whole interest in travel and telling stories. And I suppose from Hong Kong, my partner Charlie then got a job in Malaysia, and he'd followed me from London to Hong Kong. So I thought, right, probably time for me to go to Malaysia. We stayed there for a couple of years, and then ultimately he suggested cycling home. And at this point, I'm not like you, I'm not an athlete, I'm definitely not an athlete adventurer, but I found myself saying, sure, yeah, why not? Let's cycle home. And at the time, I didn't put much thought into it, John. I just thought, okay, well, if I can sit at my desk from 9 to 5, I can probably sit on a bicycle. The reality, as you know, is somewhat different to that, because we didn't really train at all. The first time I sat on a fully laden bike was as we were leaving Kuala Lumpur. And I was like, oh my gosh, what have I signed up to? I think 3 weeks in, had a complete panic at the side of the road. We'd barely hit a hill. And I was like, I can't do this, Charlie. Threw my bike down. And then, yeah, eventually he said something to me that has stuck and I've used in every other adventure, which is, this is not a physical journey. This is a mental one. And I think it was a combination of things on that trip that really sort of kickstarted this desire to have more of a quote unquote career in this space, because I realized traveling slowly and by human power, you uncover so many interesting stories. You go to places that perhaps aren't covered by mainstream media. And I just loved it. And it ticked a lot of boxes. And I sort of came home, had no job whatsoever, had a slight panic when I realised prices in London are expensive and I needed to pay the bills. So I managed to get a job at Red Bull as their adventure editor. And then slowly things started to snowball from that. Because I'd done that big journey, other people then approached me to say, look, we're looking for people to do other journeys with. And so when people say, how did you get into this? It's a complete accident. It was finding something that I was interested in, following that up, and then it kind of snowballed from there, really.
I think it's so interesting, as you said, about the physical and mental, like it's a mental journey, because so often when you start these, you sort of have this idea that you need to be really fast, you need to push yourself. And when you take a step back and actually take your time and immerse yourself in the situation, you find you uncover so much more.
Oh, absolutely. And I am a huge fan. I think the world is split between team fast and team slow, actually. And I'm fully in camp team slow because, yeah, I do think when you slow down, you definitely immerse yourself more, as you say, and you kind of get a deeper understanding. You have more time for conversation. And actually, now when I travel, one of my favorite things to do is just situate myself in a coffee shop, find where all the old men are hanging out. That's usually where I go to. Like, they usually have the best coffee. And then just chat. And really, that's like, yeah, that's just magic, really. Slowing down and really getting under the skin of a place as far as you can as a traveller.
Yeah, I remember, I think we were speaking to Geordie Stewart on episode 5 or something, 4 or 5. And he said, we basically spoke that unless you're breaking a record, no one actually cares if you travel from Malaysia to London in 101 days or 150 days. It doesn't matter. Unless you're Mark Beaumont, who we had on, and you're doing it around the world in 80 days, no one's going to care.
Mm-hmm. And actually, to that point, John, no one really cares generally about like, and I think that's the thing. That's where we've got to find meaning and enjoyment in our own lives, haven't we? Yeah,
exactly. And for people listening, I always try and tell them that this is the way to sort of go if you're going down this route. Because in your mind, you're always thinking, I need to push myself. I need to slightly suffer. We had Elsa Kent on the podcast last week, and she was talking about the same thing, that she sort of needed to go fast, when actually always at the end, there's always a slight regret of maybe if I'd just taken my time and slowed down, there would have been more opportunities.
Yeah, I think that's really insightful, because actually it's the same thing in life, isn't it? Like, why are we I don't think we often stop and question, why are we doing what we do? Why are we rushing to these things? Why do we want to do world first? Why do we want to do these grand trips? And I suppose as someone who has done some, a lot of it comes down to sort of insecurity, doesn't it? Insecurity, a desire to prove something. I think probably, and you know better because you've probably interviewed a lot of people in this space, but I feel like people are either running from something or to something, and perhaps a bit more honesty about that. And actually a lot of what you can achieve doing grand adventures can also be achieved through like therapy and discussion and a bit more introspective thought. But it's just one way to sort of understand yourself, other people in the world around you, isn't it? And I personally love it, so...
Yeah, I, as you say, because I think, we've spoken to nearly 47 people on this podcast, and there is a sort of theme around it of, when we had Emily Scott on episode 9, she talked about sort of, she was generally unhappy and sort of wanted to pursue, and probably, I don't know, similar with you or myself, it's that either your time at work where you're constantly thinking about something else and you want to sort of go out and prove yourself. And by going on these trips, you sort of feel like you need to push yourself a bit further. And as you say, it's that sort of mental, which it can be sort of used to channel in a really good direction.
Yeah, definitely. And I think a lot of the journeys that I've been on have definitely been motivated by fear. And it comes down to that sort of fear of not fully living, that sort of like, what am I doing? We get like one amazing, precious life. How am I using it? And it doesn't have to be, and this is what I'm coming to understand, it doesn't have to be these grand adventures. It can just be, and at the risk of sounding like a crazed hippie, literally just looking at the underside of a leaf, because my gosh, they're beautiful. And yeah, I think it is about that. It's just about finding what works for you guys, finding out what gives you meaning and purpose, and then trying to live a bit more in line with that. Whether that's traveling or whether that's like, going for a swim on the beach.
So during your first trip going, as you said, Malaysia to London, and that was with Charlie, who is now your boyfriend.
Yeah, long-suffering partner, about 13 years.
And so when you were doing it and sort of starting out, what was the sort of, as you say, you'd never done anything like this. What was the sort of, as you said, the sort of mental it's a mental game rather than a physical one. But for you who had never done this, what were the sort of feelings like when you were sort of, I don't know, getting ready, preparing for, I mean, what are you talking, 5-6 months?
Well, literally, in this case, it was like, shall we do it? Yes, let's do it, basically. So we knew that we wanted to go home, and we talked about maybe going back overland, but by trains and things. And I think there is something to be said for setting yourself a big, hairy goal. You know, I think I wanted to be, and this is where I think we need to be careful. At that point, I think I wanted to be the person who could say, I've cycled halfway around the world. If I'm honest, it was ego talking. What I realised when I was sat on the bike was that I had to be the person to cycle halfway around the world, and I had to put the effort in. And saying something because you want to appear a certain way and doing something is very different. And I definitely feel like these journeys have humbled me. So I think to answer your question about what sort of emotions I was going through, there was excitement at doing something incredible and hairy that I wasn't entirely sure I could achieve. There was a lot of fear. Like, oh my gosh, we've got to do this. And then also, as I mentioned, 3 weeks in, there was a lot of embarrassment because I told everybody I was going to cycle from Malaysia to London, and there I was, barely able to get up a hill. And I'm like, how? And then the negative self-talk starts, right? It's like, why did you think you were capable of this? Have you seen yourself? You're 5'4", you like to eat cake, your ass is super padded. All this like negative chatter that we all have that kind of prevent us from doing what we really want to do, all that started up. And so I think the beauty of adventure is that it just pushes you to all sides of yourself. There are times when you're like, oh my God, go me, look at me go, like that feeling of pride and confidence. And then, as you know as well, you have the unbelievable lows. They're like, what am I doing? Like, this was a terrible idea. How did I think I was capable of this? So I think that to me is what I love about adventure, because it's not always positive. And I think that reflects life in so many ways. We are pushed down our throats in life. Like, it's all about happiness. And I think that's slightly misleading, because I think this constant focus on being happy inevitably makes us more unhappy, because actually maybe we should focus on the wonderful range of emotions that we feel as humans. And if we can accept that we have these bad days and accept that we have amazing days, and just take them for what they are, then it sort of becomes easier to deal with. And ultimately, ironically, you become happier for it. So yeah, I think that's, to me, like, what I loved about the travel was the lows as well as the highs.
I think, I don't know, it was the same with you, because, as you say, very sort of similar. The first trip was a big cycle ride, having gone from nothing to a big cycle ride. It was the first 3 weeks which were the most painful, the most sort of draining on your body. And it was probably similar to you. And that's, if once you get past the 3 weeks, then it's just a sort of slog of everyday cycling, but your legs have sort of getting used to it.
Yeah, and how did you deal with it, John?
Well, I remember sort of I was going across America, and as I said, I'd done very little training for it, but the first 3 days, it was fine. And then suddenly your legs just stiffen up, getting off, your legs feel like jelly, like you cannot walk. But then suddenly, I think on like the second week or third week, it was all gone. And then from there, it was not plain sailing per se, but you had the strength and the stamina to just keep slowly building up, and your legs were always just getting used to it now. Yeah,
I think that's so interesting, isn't it? Because actually, I think before I did this sort of journey, I looked at people who had done crazy journeys, and I thought, God, like, I'm not like you. There's no way I can do this. And actually, I think everybody could do it. If you can sit at a desk from 9 to 5, you can sit on a bike, or you can sit in a kayak, or it's just about kind of gritting it out a bit, isn't it? It's pushing through that day 3 when you're like, oh my God, my legs. And I think if you do that for long enough, then suddenly these things, you grow and you develop, don't you?
Yeah, because we were also speaking, like, when you're on these sort of trips, day to day is pretty much the same. You just get up, cycle, eat, cycle, sleep, repeat.
Yeah.
And so that, like a day job, that's your job as it is. You're just going through the motions again and again and seeing incredible things along the way.
Absolutely. And it becomes so simple. And that's the other thing, the other secret of adventures is you don't have to worry about all the other stuff, the admin and the to-do list. It's like, if you can wake up, keep yourself alive, go to bed, like that's a successful day. And I think there's something really beautifully simple about that. And actually, I realized that on my journey in Guyana, a kayak journey, which I'm sure we'll touch on soon. But yeah, it was just beautifully simple. And suddenly there's so many benefits to technology, and I love it. We wouldn't be able to speak now, but equally, we are bombarding ourselves with more and more stimulus, and we are part of nature ultimately. And I think when we strip everything away and we allow that quietness to come back into our lives, it does shift a lot of things, and it does bring up a lot of things that maybe we wouldn't notice in our otherwise busy and hectic lives.
I sort of found it like a sort of form of meditation when you're cycling, I don't know, on a straight road for 6 hours straight. Because that's all you're doing is just looking ahead, cycling. You're thinking of nothing else other than what's ahead of you. And it is that sort of form of meditation where you're just sort of so absorbed in the now and not thinking about anything else.
Yeah, and just the spinning of the legs. And it's just, when you get into that flow state, it is just magic. But there are also days where you're like, oh my God, what am I doing? Like, what? How do I distract myself? Where's my next food coming from? Like all of that.
Yeah, there are those moments, especially when it gets to dusk and you haven't found a place to camp. You're like, yes. God, this could be interesting. And so how long did it take you to get from Malaysia to London?
So that took us 13 months. So to your point about slow travel, like Charlie, he's tall, lanky, very much a cycling build, if you like. I'm, as I mentioned, 5'4" and like to eat cake. So I think I inevitably slowed him down. But ironically, he said he wouldn't change it. So that was a 13-month journey. Came back home just before Christmas. All very exciting. And then the reality of, oh gosh, like we need to pay bills and get a job. So yeah, it was fun.
Reality hits home.
Mm-hmm. Uh-huh.
And from that trip, what were the sort of lessons do you think you learned? Because as you say, amazingly, you and Charlie are still together after such a long and probably quite intense trip.
Oh my gosh, well, you literally see everything, John. There's like the romance, the mystery, shall we say, has gone. But there's something beautiful about that as well. That kind of sense that you know someone and you got those shared stories of being like, oh, do you remember when we did this? And I sort of think if we can survive that together, we can pretty much get through anything. So, I would highly recommend it as a test of a relationship. It's like a good indoctrination, so to speak. But yeah, I loved it. I really loved it. I wouldn't change it.
And what were the sort of amazing stories that you still tell each other 13 years later?
Well, we narrowly escaped being blown up in Tajikistan. So we accidentally camped in a field of mortars. And we only realised this because we sort of cycled, pushed up, you're saying like looking for somewhere to camp. And we pushed our bikes off the side of the road on the Pamir highway, and Tajikistan had a little river running like between Afghanistan and Tajikistan. And so over the decades, there'd been a lot of mortars sort of sent backwards and forwards. And we gingerly put our bikes to the side of the road and tried to look for somewhere to camp. And suddenly Charlie looked down and went, oh my God, there's an unexploded mortar about yay big. So we kind of wheeled our bikes back onto the road really slowly and carefully, cycled on a bit. It was getting really dark and we just had to set up camp. So we found what we thought was like a safe area, set up our tent. And the next morning, as I went to take my tent peg out, looked down and there was another massive mortar, which we just narrowly escaped sleeping on. So yeah, as soon as we got to the capital, we basically went, by the way, there's a couple of mines in this particular area or unexploded mortars you might want to look at, which was possibly the most hairy moment of the trip, but it was all fine, survived it. And then just, other things like being invited into a wedding in Uzbekistan, we're sweating, smelly, that like vinegar smell that you get when you sweated too much and your clothes haven't been washed, just pulled into a wedding, like vodka shoved into our hands. And it was amazing. And I think it was the people, like it's so cliched, but I think connection, and for me that's what travel and adventure is about, is connection, whether it's with yourself, with other people, or the world around you. And I think I came back from that journey just realizing, having worked in traditional media where there's a little saying that if it bleeds it leads, which is a horrible expression, but I was very disillusioned covering news. It's not the most uplifting, shall we say, whereas when you're actually going out and meeting people in the world, you realize actually 99% of people are blooming amazing, and mainstream media just focuses on the kind of, well, the sensational stories. And it just gave me a whole new perspective on the kind of stories and the kind of storytelling I wanted to do.
Whereabouts was that? Was that sort of down the sort of Wakan corridor, or are we talking a bit further on?
Yeah, exactly that, the Wakan corridor.
Ah, amazing. Such a beautiful place down there.
Oh my God, isn't it? It's just, yeah. And for anyone who's not been, I would definitely recommend checking it out at some point. But it's otherworldly, isn't it? You feel like so insignificant. You got mountains sort of rising up and you're going down this pass, and the stars at night are just bonkers. And I loved it. I absolutely loved it.
Yeah. Horrific terrain though for cyclists.
Oh my God, yeah, if you're cycling, get ready to bring a puncture repair kit, and it's very bumpy, so you spend your whole time just like bumping up and down, but bone shaking.
When we were there, we saw so many cyclists, and they said like their day rates had gone from sort of 70, 80 miles down to about 10 or 20 miles every day while they're in Tajikistan.
Yeah, well, this is the beauty of traveling slowly, you see. You can just be like, what's another slow day?
4,000 meters above sea level, going up these very steep, rugged terrains.
Yeah.
You've got to love it.
Yeah, it definitely, there was leg burn. Definitely leg burn.
And so you came back to London, and you were pursuing journalism. Oh no, you got the job with Red Bull that sort of led to more sort of people sort of asking you to go on these adventures. And was that the one where you were cycling across South America with
Reza? Yeah, Reza Pakravan. Yeah, that's exactly it. So I was in Red Bull's office, and I got an email notification about this guy called Reza Pakravan was looking for someone who had cycled and was also interested in the environment. And I thought, that sounds really interesting. So I sort of dropped him a note and said, yeah, I'm interested. He was also looking for someone with TV experience, and I'd been working as a news anchor in Hong Kong. So I just dropped him a note. We met up for a drink. I really, really liked him. We got on really well. And ultimately he said, yeah, do you want to come join me? And his plan was to travel along the Trans-Amazonian Highway in Brazil and Peru. It's through Brazil, but into Peru as well. Looking at deforestation and how it impacts people on the ground. And essentially we ended up doing that, and it was a fantastic trip, but it was also unbelievably heartbreaking. And you realize, especially now at the moment, the environment's like very much front of mind, just exactly the global impact of what we consume and what we use, and how it impacts all of us, really. And I hadn't really linked before that trip what I was consuming to the source. But when you're cycling past burning forests and you can smell it, when it's such a visceral experience, when you got the smoke in your nostrils and the dirt of the road in your lungs, and you suddenly think, God, this is because I want a beef burger, and this land's being cleared for cattle ranching or palm oil, or and that was pretty eye-opening, to say the least. And then talking to people whose family members had been murdered through illegal logging, and gut-wrenching stories of gold mining and mercury poisoning, and then suddenly I'm like, whoa, okay, this is a much bigger issue than I'd ever really kind of considered or thought about. So that was a journey that had a purpose to it. And I think, our purpose when I was cycling back from Malaysia to London was, we needed to get home. It was very much an A to B type journey. And then this journey with Reza was different again, because it was an adventure with purpose. And I definitely took a lot from that as well. And it's something that I'd like to continue to do more of, because I found that quite meaningful.
What was the cycle? How long were you sort of cycling for?
So the whole trip was 3 months, and it was a mixture of sort of cycling the highway. It was a mixture of taking small biplanes, and then inevitably, because it was a filmed thing for TV, you'd spend time in the van as well. So it was different again, because it wasn't like every day on the bicycle going A to B. It was very much like purpose driven, like we need to interview these people, telling the story through the mechanism of the bicycle. So different again.
Oh, wow. And with that, I mean, as you say, you heard some of the most sort of gut-wrenching stories. And the sort of, because you're spending 3 months sort of on and off with him, how did you find, we've spoken a lot on this podcast about the partner that you pick going on these trips, because they're incredibly intense at times. And if you can sort of tolerate, because as I said, quite a few times, as last week we had Elsa, and she was saying like when she did her trip, she was encouraged to get a partner to come and do it. And I always say you've got to be very specific about who you pick and about the sort of relationship you have. What was the sort of difference between Reza and Charlie, in a sense of you didn't know Reza before you went on this big trip?
That's a really interesting question, because with Charlie, you know, it's unconditional. You know, you can have a bad day and you can be like, but when you're getting to know somebody, it's the whole different dynamic, especially doing a journey that's physical and long hours. And I'm happy to say Reza is now like a brother to me, and I love him to bits. But what was fascinating is that inevitably when you spend 24/7 with someone, little niggles will come up, and with the best will in the world, whether it's your absolute life partner or whether it's someone you've just met, there will be a little bit of tension. And I think what I've come to realise doing more of these journeys, especially not just this one with Reza, but also one I did with Ness and Laura Bingham, was that conflicts do arise, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just how do you handle them? And actually, on the kayak journey, we went to see a psychotherapist before we set off, or a psychologist. I'm never sure of the difference, to be honest, John. And one thing that was really handy was he said, you know, make sure you have a common goal. So if you have a common goal, the chance of conflict is dramatically reduced. And I think that came up on the trip with Reza, is that he was trying to speed. He's a speed cyclist. You know, he's broken world records for cycling fast. I am at the other end of the spectrum. So although we had a common goal of producing a documentary, the mechanism of getting there was somewhat different. So that inevitably did cause a little bit of like tension. But equally, I think that made me realise that as someone who will actively avoid conflict, you know, if you are meant to be friends with someone, you can have a bit of conflict and you can resolve it and you can be friends. And that was really powerful for me. To realise that just because you say a bad or cross word, it doesn't mean that's the end of a friendship.
Very nice. And 3-month journey, I mean, I don't want to sort of ask you to sort of tell some of the stories that you probably saw and heard from there. But maybe, I mean, can you, or the sort of story? Oh, right. They sounded pretty intense.
Well, as in the arguing, or just the
No, I meant like the stories from that documentary, some of the gut-wrenching stories that you were sort of talking about, and some of the maybe stories of hope and joy.
Yeah, so I think that was a thing on this trip. You know, we were going into very remote areas and looking at how communities are dealing with deforestation, and we met this one lady called Diana. And unfortunately, her father had been murdered trying to protect the indigenous land which his family lived on. And she's now a campaigner, kind of campaigning for indigenous rights to the land, because basically it's been shown that when indigenous people have land rights, the deforestation is greatly reduced. So that's one of the major ways that deforestation can be reduced. And just sort of talking to her, you know, you can hear these stories, but when you're looking eyeball to someone, when you're hearing and feeling their pain, it really brings it to life in a way that, you know, we can talk about deforestation from the comfort of our homes and then check and scroll through Instagram. But when you're like, oh my gosh, you know, you've actually lost your dad, your family at risk every single day. And I think that for me was just really woke me up to the issue. And then also the solutions. We met so many people who are like putting GPS detectors on trees that have like a microphone in, which will alert communities to any sort of noise of a chainsaw. And you think, wow, okay, there's some real cool tech solutions to this problem as well. Or people trying to farm in a more sustainable way. So there was a lot of hope there too. And I think that I came back in one sense going, oh God, everything is screwed. Like, end of the world is here already. And then on the other hand, I was like, well, actually, no, there are a lot of really amazing people working really hard on solutions. So we've got to kind of focus on the hope a little bit.
I think there's also quite a bit sort of just coming out of COP26, which one hopes will show a bit of encouragement towards it.
I hope so. And I hope it's not, to quote Greta, but blah, blah, blah. I hope it's like genuinely meaningful change, because, I think it's so easy to think, oh, this is a governmental thing and this is business things. But actually, as individuals, we can all kind of look at what are we consuming, what's the source of it, and en masse, there's like real power in the purse. So I think it needs to be concerted effort, individuals, businesses and governments kind of all pulling together to avoid conflict, find one common goal, which hopefully is to like not shaft the planet. So we live in hope.
And I suppose your trip from there, was that the sort of, when you saw it and saw South America and the sort of places around there, was that your sort of encouragement to go back to Guyana?
Yeah, so I came back from that trip, and I was obviously, I think anyone who loves to travel will know what I mean by like the whole itchy feet thing. You know, when you're stationary for too long, it's like, I need to get out. And it just so happened that I'd met this lady called Laura Bingham at an adventure festival called Campfire. And she rang me up one afternoon. I think I must have been post-lunch at Red Bull, you know, when you're like slightly in that post-lunch slump in a bit of a food haze. And she said, you know, how do you feel about doing a world first kayaking journey, source to sea, down Guyana's Essequibo River? And I think I must have thought, float down a river, pina colada in hand, you know. So I essentially agreed to it, having done like very little kayaking in my life. The only time I'd kayaked was in New Zealand. And I hated it. I thought it was a rubbish sport. Couldn't understand why anyone did it. But anyway, we sort of trained for 6 months in the darkness of winter in Wales for a hot, humid Amazonian expedition. And that was a journey, I think, that has changed me like no other. I got quite sick off the back of it. I got leishmaniasis, which is a flesh-eating parasite. Had to have chemotherapy on my return to try and get rid of it. You're never entirely sure if it's gone. But in a funny way, it was also one of the best experiences of my life, because the journey was incredible. I think there's a lot of good you can do with that as well, because talking about doing these journeys and stumbling across stories, I found out that leishmaniasis, the disease I got, you know, it's a neglected tropical disease, second biggest parasitic killer after malaria. But most people who get it are poor and live in remote areas. So there's not much sort of awareness raised about it. So it's sometimes like, to the point we were making earlier, is, you know, life hands everyone all sorts, you know, you don't know what card you're going to be dealt. And it's like trying to make the most of the card you have been given. I think that was a journey that awoke me in many ways, so to speak. And
I mean, that as you said, that was a sort of world first with Laura and Ness. And when you spoke recently about the psychotherapist saying the sort of common goal, obviously the common goal was to get from source to sea. Was that in the quickest time possible, or was that with a sort of further purpose of looking at local communities, speaking with them?
Yeah, so this was a fascinating journey in the sense of the goal was source to sea, world first. So that was the goal. But within that, you know, you're going from pristine virgin forest at the source to the Atlantic Ocean, and it takes in the breadth of the communities along the way. And we did it in conjunction with the YY community, which are the community closest to the source of the river. And we had 5 guides with us going to the source, and then 2 guides, Ant and Ramel, joined us for the journey to the Atlantic Ocean. And what we saw and witnessed on this journey was sort of that slow creep of humanity, going from this beautiful, untouched wilderness to passing gold mines. You know, we could no longer drink the water. We couldn't wash in it because of the mercury that's used to extract the gold. Can make you very sick. And it was really interesting seeing the impact of humanity on our environment. And we passed one of the second biggest open pit mine in South America called Oh My Mine. And around it, you got sort of sparse trees where the dense rainforest had once been. And you got like capuchin monkeys clinging on to their last bit of land. And sort of seeing that and going, God, okay, wow, I know what's further upstream. I don't know what's coming downstream, but it really, we felt the journey of that river that so many people call home. And I think it was a really interesting journey in that regard.
Wow. It's, with the three of you, well, five of you going all the way, and it was just kayaking the whole way. So the first bit we had a team hiking to the source. And I say hiking to the source, a good movement during the day is 4 kilometers. So you are literally hacking your way through dense primary rainforest. And, in that section, we went to see the helicopter rescue people before we set off. And they said, look, we can absolutely rescue you, but not in that particular bit because we need an area for the rotator blades in order to be able to land. So we essentially knew we were shafted in that particular section if something went wrong. And that was when, I nearly sat on a deadly snake. Unfortunately, I got my foot stuck between a log and a vine, and I was waggling it for about, must have been a minute and a half or so. And then from behind me, Laura goes, oh my gosh, there's a snake. And literally 2 inches under my bottom was something called the labaria snake, which is known for its fast, swift and deadly attacks. Next thing I know, Jackson, one of our guides, is macheted it to death. And I just looked at Jackson. I'm like, Jackson, why did you kill the snake? And he just stared back at me and said, well, Pip, if I didn't kill the snake, it would have killed you. And then, whoa, that is a moment where you are fully confronted with your own ego and your own insecurities. And I think that really changed the whole trip for me because, I was suddenly going to sleep, like panicking. I was having night terrors. I couldn't settle my spirit because I'm like, I just want to run home. I just want to go home. And in that moment, I kind of realized, you can't change your problems, but you can change your reaction to them. And I think one of the bravest things I did on that trip was sort of open up to my teammates and say, guys, I'm really struggling here emotionally. I don't know how to deal with this. And suddenly, rather than sleeping on the edge of the team, like in my hammock, I would suddenly be put in the middle, and then a fire would appear when there hadn't been a fire at night before. And I think it was little things like that that really sort of made me appreciate the environment, appreciate how small we are in the grand scheme of life, and actually not being top of the food chain was very, very humbling. And then also technology, suddenly only being able to access tech when we physically wanted to. We had to set up a satellite system, and it's called a BGAN, and anytime we could see open sky, sort of point it up to the sky. And I realized on that journey, tech is so in control of me. Like I was feeling this urge to check social media, and having had a Jaguar come through our camp, I can absolutely say that the feeling of getting a notification or an email ping is not dissimilar to when a Jaguar comes through your camp. Obviously it's heightened, but we are zapping ourselves day in, day out with these low-level threats. But in the jungle, when the threat goes away, you can relax a little bit. But in sort of urban life, we can't because they're constantly there. So I sort of came back from this journey with a new appreciation of not just life, but how to sort of maybe use tech to enable life to be that little bit better rather than it controlling me in quite the same way. Wow, that just sounds absolutely incredible. And this was a long journey with Ness and Laura, and were they the same? Did they have their own sort of...
Well, I mean, all of us, all our teammates, like Ramel, for example, he had a new baby. He had a baby the day before we set off. He didn't even know the name of his child. And, for the YY community, guiding is one of the ways to earn money. And he decided that that's what he wanted to come and do. So I think we all had our individual battles and struggles, and Laura especially, because she had an 8-month-old baby at the time. And this was the most dangerous thing I have ever done. On a daily basis, we were encountering scorpions, snakes. We were paddling past 18-foot caiman. I picked up a neglected tropical disease that, could eat off my face, essentially. So it's like, whoa, it was one of those journeys where I think everybody struggled to varying degrees. It was also like we would belly laugh daily. So to that point about adventure, you have the highs and you have the lows. I've never felt more alive in some senses, and I've never felt more on edge in others.
God. Sorry, did you say you didn't laugh or you did laugh?
Oh no, we did every day.
Right.
We would belly laugh. We would howl with laughter. I mean, just some of these situations, and I think that laughter is such a good tool just for coping generally, isn't it? And there was such joy in that bond, and anyone who's done like a team thing knows there is a real kind of bond that happens when you spend time with each other, like for good and for bad, But yeah, we left as family ultimately. And, I've seen far too much of those ladies to be otherwise.
God, it sounds such an amazing trip. And as you say, the sort of bond that you have at the end of that is just incredible. And the stories you can probably tell for years to come.
Yeah, I think one of the really important things that I took from that trip, though, was the role of travel and the ethics of travel and who's traveling and why and what's the impact. And it was something that I hadn't really thought about enough before, if I'm honest, John. As a white privileged traveller from the global north with a platform, however small, I received a message on the journey from someone I really admire and respect on Twitter, and it was a direct message. And they said, Pip, what you're doing is remarkable, not least because it is neo-colonial and racist. And then, that's a hell of a message to receive. My initial reaction was very unhelpful. It was sort of one of classic white fragility, tears and embarrassment, and the worry that people were going to see me and what I was doing as racist. And then I kind of really thought about the comment a little bit further, and I realized, actually, as someone who has traveled and someone who has had the privilege to travel, I hadn't thought enough about it. And actually, by putting up selfie after selfie, or by only presenting a country through my image and my lens, that is a form of neocolonialism, and that is racist. And ultimately, I came to realize on that journey, there's so much about the work that I've done previously that I would do differently, and I'm really genuinely sorry for how I presented myself on social media through that expedition. But it was a really interesting learning that, we can be well-intentioned, but we can still unintentionally hurt other people around us. And I think it's just something I wanted to raise, because I don't think enough of us in the adventure industry are necessarily aware of it if we're white travelers. And I think it's something that's super important. And I think it needs to be discussed because, it's uncomfortable to think of yourself as your actions as being racist, but quite often we are without intending to be.
I think it sort of depends. I know Benedict Allen, who was on the podcast, when he came back from Papua New Guinea, he was accused of being racist. But as he said, when he travels, his whole understanding his whole concept to travel is about learning. It's about going to these cultures and learning from them. It's not about going in and sort of, taking whatever. It's about sort of learning from the different cultures and seeing that your way is not necessarily the right way or the only way. And as I say, he was just accused because he was in a Papua New Guinea tribe, and because of him being a white male, I think the Guardian came after him saying that what he was doing was a form of colonial exploring back from a Victorian age. But as you say, his intentions were just to go and learn.
Yeah. And I think this raises an interesting point that maybe I think travelers need to think about more generally, is why have we been welcomed into the communities that we're going to? Is there an exchange of knowledge? I think this is, I'm not articulating myself brilliantly, but there definitely needs to be not a one-way thing. It needs to be an exchange, and we need to make sure that we are actually welcomed into countries, because I think that's the thing about colonialism, isn't it? It's like previously people would just go into a country and say, oh, what can I learn, or what can I take, whereas there needs to be a new way of thinking and a new discussion around this, I think. So as I say, I'm not articulating myself brilliantly, but I do think there needs to be an awareness on the part of the traveller about should I even be going here? For example, our expedition, should I be doing a world first in a country that's not my own? There's a whole load of ethical questions that have definitely come up for me as a result of this journey that I hadn't thought enough about. And I'm still trying to, as you can probably hear, puzzle it all out. But I definitely think the conversation needs to be had.
But do you think that when Laura Bingham brought it to you, her idea was a world first, but it was more also about, learning? Because by going to Guyana, you're learning about their way of life. You're learning about their communities, their people. And, let's just say you're not welcome. If you got to the community and you weren't welcome, you would leave.
Well, in this particular incident, we had to get permission. We had to clear it with the government. At every stage, and actually on every journey, it's especially important to get all the right kind of clearances. But yeah, it's when does learning become exploitation? I think that's the key thing. It's yes, it's fantastic, and I think that's one of the benefits of travel. It's there is so much we can learn, and that's one of my favourite things, my favourite quotes actually, is everyone can teach you something. But it comes down to, is this exploitative in any way? If yes, we need to reevaluate.
Did you think that with your trip?
I think what I came to realise is that actually social media can exacerbate that massively. I was guilty of posting selfie after selfie after selfie. And I wish I hadn't. And so, yes, in that sense, I think the message that I received was accurate. I think unintentionally, the way I presented Guyana probably was through a neo-colonial lens. And for that, I'm genuinely sorry. Did I intend to do it? Absolutely not. And it's just made me really consider, how to travel going forward. And I think, and we talk about it often, but when you take a photo, make sure you say, can I take a photo? Have permission. And it's just kind of the general courtesies of the ethics of travel, which, that go beyond just having an adventure because it's good fun.
Yeah, very, very true. Someone took a picture of me in the street, I'd feel pretty uncomfortable.
Yeah, exactly. So I think it's just coming down to being a decent human being and thinking a bit deeper, which maybe I neglected to do. And yeah.
So do you think it was just by posting that on social media, the way you were representing, that you found troubling?
I think travel itself is problematic. I mean, there's some wonderful benefits to it, like you were saying about learning, and I definitely, and I love it as well. It is good for connection, and it's good to bridge understanding and foster understanding. But it's also got its dark side, and I think we just need to check in more regularly, as to what the motivation is here and what is the impact, and how are we impacting the country and people that we are lucky enough and privileged enough to be going to.
Yeah, I think that's very true. I think, with flying and everything, you need to sort of, look at about why. But I also think that by traveling, you broaden your horizons, and you open yourself up to all sorts of new ideas and new experiences, in a sense of, if you just confine yourself to an area, that's all you know. It's like if you live in a cardboard box, that's all you'll know. And by going out and exploring, you get to know these new communities, a different way of life. You know that your way is not the only way. And otherwise you become very narrow-minded in a sense of, this is the only way it should be done, and this is the only way to go.
Yeah, no, I totally get that, but I think in a globalized world, and ironically I'm not arguing against this point.
No. It's an interesting sort of discussion to sort of have.
Yeah, but I think in a globalized world that there are ways to get outside of that, definitely. And I think that was the main takeaway from this trip. Is it just made me reconsider, the ethics of travel.
No, very, very, very true. So in terms of sort of going on, it's sort of like you're sort of saying more of a VR type situation, or are you saying?
No. I definitely think there's a place for travel. I think it's brilliant, and I think people should still be doing it. But maybe we need to be doing it less, and we definitely need to be considering who's profiting from the travel. If you're saying traveling to a country, is it a local tour operator that you're using, or is it a foreign tour operator? In which case you want to be trying to put money back into local pockets. You want to make sure that tourists are actually welcomed in a place. I know, I appreciate the irony of saying this as someone who's traveled and who hasn't thought about it enough. But yeah, I'm kind of just raising it as something that I wish I had thought more about.
No, very true. I mean, what's it, next summer? I think the plan is to do a documentary with about 8 others looking at sustainable tourism. And so going to different communities around Europe, looking at more sustainable ways of travel in those sort of communities. And in terms of, rather than, in this sort of social media age when, a sort of big travel influencer puts sort of tag of this place, suddenly, let's just say Rainbow Mountain in Colombia, is it? Is it Rainbow Mountain or Peru?
In Peru, yeah.
Suddenly this place which had no tourists suddenly is now, on every social media, swarms of tourists go there to have their picture taken on Rainbow Mountain. And is that sustainable for the future? You've seen Thailand cut off beach access to tourists so that the coral reefs can regrow again. It's sort of looking at different aspects about how sustainable tourism can be more managed in a sense.
Oh my God, I want to watch that, John. That sounds amazing.
But no, I think you raised a really interesting point. And as I say, yeah, there are times, of course, when you are going through and you do have that sort of uneasy feeling of, what am I doing here? Or am I here for the right reasons?
And I think, listen to that, if there's a sense of unease and it's a gut feeling that maybe something's a bit off, but, we're not perfect humans, are we? We all cock up, we all make mistakes, and we all learn and grow from that. So I think, we can but kind of try and improve.
Of course. Well, it has been such a pleasure listening to your stories. There's a part of the show where we ask the same 5 questions to each guest each week, with the first being, on these sort of trips and expeditions that you do, what's the one gadget that you always take with you?
It's not so much a gadget, but it's a diary. I keep a daily diary. So, yeah. Well, actually, I suppose on that sense, it's my iPhone, because I always write my diary on my iPhone.
Oh, very nice. Yeah, I think that's really important. I know on one of my trips 3 years ago, I always try to, well, actually, I was sort of filming it. So I was sort of trying to capture different parts, but also writing it down, always key. What's your favorite travel or adventure book?
I'm going to cheat a bit on this one, because I think travel is echoed in life, like I mentioned. And I think, have you heard of the Poetry Pharmacy?
No.
Oh my gosh. So if you haven't checked it out, I really recommend it. I love poetry, and for each emotion, there's a little poem prescription. So if you're feeling like happy, there's a little happy poem there, or anxious, or whatever the emotion is that you're feeling. And there's a poem for that. And I just love it because, yeah, I think there's a lot of insight and a lot of wisdom. You don't have to have travelled through countries, travelling through life. And that I love. I love that little book.
And why are adventures important to you?
to our point earlier that everyone can teach you something. And I think, like as we grow old, we refine our ways, right?
Very true.
Let's not get stuck in our ways. Let's refine them.
Very true. And what is your favorite quote or motivational quote?
Well, I would say everyone can teach you something. Towards the end, when we were paddling to the Atlantic Ocean, I find mantra really powerful. And I was going, you can do this, you are doing this. You can do this, you are doing this, to every paddle stroke as the headwind was battling us. So yeah, one of those two. You can do it, you are doing it, or everyone can teach you something.
What was the feeling like when you got to the mouth of the river?
It was funny. It's like we turned up and I'm like, I can see where we're going to finish. And then we had this blooming headwind. You had huge waves because we'd hit the Atlantic Ocean. And I remember, John, just seeing this pink house on my right for what felt like hours. I was just like really paddling and I wasn't moving. I was like, oh. And there was a point where I'm like, we are not going to make this. And then finally we get there and our fixer on the ground had set up like a banner to welcome us back, which had disintegrated into the sea. We stopped outside a fish processing plant, so it just stank of shrimp. And then I finally got out my boat. We got all the media from Guyana lined up. I managed to slip, land on a groin, paddle whacked me on the head. I mean, it was classic clumsy Stewart here. And it wasn't the most salubrious finish, let's put it like that.
Were you using like a traditional kayak or a more...
So we did a mix. On the way to the source, we used a traditional dugout canoe because there were so many, like obviously the river narrows and we didn't want it to get... We had inflatable kayaks for the remainder of the journey and we didn't want them to be punctured. So we sort of did a mix. The first bit, getting to the source, the traditional canoe, and then the inflatable lightweight kayaks for portaging around rapids and waterfalls later on in the journey, which were individual. So we had that nice dynamic between being in a team in the canoe and then being in individual kayaks for the remainder of the journey.
Amazing. And so did you have family there at the end or?
No. So it was just the media, and then we packed up our kayaks and put them in a taxi and went back, and it was a strange sort of finish, but you know. Yeah,
usually they're always quite underwhelming.
Yeah, because you kind of big it up and then you're like, oh my gosh, I've been dreaming of a bed for 3 months and now I'm in a bed and I'm like, I want to be back in my hammock. And the hotel had run out of food and it was just like one of those things where you're like, oh, this is not how I imagined our night of celebration to go. But, you know, it is what it is.
People listening are always keen to travel and go on these sort of big grand adventures. What's the one thing you would recommend for people wanting to get started?
Ask for help and have a sense of humour, because I think ultimately if you're new at something, you're going to be a bit rubbish, right? So just get used to the fact that, you know, you're a bit rubbish and just crack on. Like, I think the biggest question I would say is ask yourself, what would happen if I didn't do this? And I think that's for me where the fear kicks in. It's like, actually, I've got more fear of not living my life like I want to than I do by doing this big hairy goal.
Very nice. And Pip, for people listening, how can they sort of follow you and find you on your sort of big adventures?
Well, I'm on Instagram and Twitter at Pip Stewart. I've just written a book about the Guyana trip called Life Lessons from the Amazon. So you can read that and kind of see. I tried to take each chapter a learning about the trip, whether it's like happiness or appreciation or conflict, and tie it to stories that happened along the way. So yeah. Check out the book if you're so inclined. Is that
an illustration or is that a sort of diary of the time?
So it's a mixture of both. Essentially, it's a diary, but trying to tie the stories in, because to our point right at the beginning, often people don't care about these journeys, right, John? No one gives a monkeys, and it's often like, what can I learn from this trip? So I wanted to bring I hate to use the word wisdom, but more like the lessons that I learned along the way, so people can kind of use them in their own daily lives. So a mixture of lessons and stories to illustrate those lessons.
Very nice. Yeah, well, you can probably perfect time coming up to Christmas now.
Hopefully.
Well, we'll leave a link to the book in the description below, and you can check Pip out at Instagram and all her social handles. And Pip, I just thank you so much for coming on today. It's been such a pleasure listening to your stories.
Oh, likewise, John. And I really hope, and I can't wait to see this documentary.
Yeah, it needs to get off the ground first.
Yeah, like most things, but it sounds really good. Really good.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much.
Cool. Thank you, John.
Well, that is it for today. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you got something out of it. If you did, hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already. And I will see you in the next video.